try again. Press the button, the orange light is on. Is that right? Oh,
Gotta talk louder. You
Just-
can pull your mask down.
oh, can I? Oh, yay, can breathe. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kit Leggett from the Social Sciences Subcommittee, and I'm very happy to welcome you to another one of Fred Johnson's series, Dr. Fred Johnson's series on military. This, and as a matter of fact, is aligned with World War II, and I'll tell you about that in just a little bit. But I'm looking around and I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces. So, Fred, your groupies are coming back. Here they are in person. This is great. This is great. Fred just loves to see everybody in person, and we all understand that. You may already know that Dr. Fred Johnson is a Marine, U.S. Marine Corps veteran, and he also is on the faculty, full-time teaching faculty at Hope College. He's been there for over 20 years, teaching in the history department. And his specialties, I would say, are military history and American Civil War, African history, and he also has taught classes in modern European history. And his degrees have been taken in his BS from Bowie State in Maryland, master's and PhD, both from Kent State University in Ohio. And I'd like to read something to you about what he's going to say today, because I don't want to get it wrong for you. And it's called, he entitles it CBI, but this stands for the China-Burma-India Theatre during the Second World War. And it's sometimes called the Forgotten Theater. It was the United States military designation for an area of Asia during World War II. And once the US entered the war, American strategy called for building up China as a source of manpower and as a base for bombers in the eventual invasion of Japan. So that is where Dr. Johnson's going to start today. And today's specific chapter is called Before the Storm. Years before the start of World War II, excuse me, Japan, the United States, and China were already raging life and death struggles to determine which nation would dominate in Asia. So with that, I would like to ask you to hold your questions until the end for Dr. Johnson. He appreciates that. And I would like to welcome back to all of you here, Dr. Fred Johnson.
Good morning, everybody. It really is good to see you all. For those of you who are here for the recent foreign policy discussion on Korea, good to see you again. Like Kit pointed out, CBI stood for China-Burma-India Theatre, and most people who study World War II, a lot of veterans during World War, during the war, after the war especially, refer to it as the forgotten conflict, the forgotten theater. And that's not too hard to understand, because after all, with the European theater, what you have the war in Europe with the invasion of Russia, for example, in 1941, eventually D-Day in 1944. With regard to the Pacific theater, you have the bombing of Pearl Harbor, then the eventual evacuation from Corregidor by General MacArthur, and then the long walk back to the Philippines, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So there are so many things to capture our attention and our imagination from the other theaters of war that it really is kind of easy to overlook the CBI. But we're not for the CBI, like the other two theaters of war. The CBI is kind of like that child that never says anything, but they're the ones you should be watching. Because there was a lot going on. There was a lot going on in the China-Burma-India Theater that frankly made what happened, not so much in the European theater, but definitely in the Pacific theater, and definitely toward the end, possible. This map, I always tell my students in teaching in any kind of history class that if you let it, a map will tell you a story. A map is just lines, it's more than lines on a page. more than just arrangements of country. I promise you that if you look at a map of Europe in 1900, a map of Europe in 1914, a map of Europe in 1919, a map of Europe in 1920, or a map of Europe in 1946, you might think you're looking at different planets. But it's just because the political geography changes with regard to the movement of human beings, conflicts, and the will and disposition of winners and losers. And losers end up pretty much drawing the maps. So likewise, this map right here should give us some time to think. Consider you see the South China Sea there, in French Indochina, which speaks all by itself to a certain time in history, doesn't it? When it's called French Indochina, not Vietnam. And then of course there's China, Burma, or Myanmar today, and so on. But I thought it might be appropriate, since we're talking about China, Burma, and India, not only would it be appropriate, but it almost would be an insult to not start here. On March 31st, 2009, this woman right here was interviewed by the Boston Globe. She said, "I usually don't cry in public, but it doesn't mean I don't cry." She said, "I cry inside." Well, who is this woman? Her name is Ying Chang. And it turns out that she was talking about an event that happened in relation to her daughter, pictured here. And her daughter's name is Iris Chang. Now, Iris Chang, in 2003, I think it was 2003, wrote a book entitled The Rape of Nanking. Iris Chang, of course, being a Chinese American, was kind of disturbed by the fact that everybody, of course, talks about the Holocaust, and we should talk about the Holocaust. There are Holocaust deniers out there, if you can believe that. Ahmadinejad, the former Iranian president, was an avid Holocaust denier, but he had, of course, political motivations for doing that, as well as his innate ignorance. But Iris Chang, upset about the fact that nobody knew about what happened to China under the hand, under the guns, under the heels, the boots of the Chinese, or rather the Japanese army during World War II. So she wrote The Rape of Nanking, which is she did her research, she did her job, and she did it well. It is a very, very in-your-face accounting of what happened in the 6 weeks of summer of 1937 to 1938. When, if it's possible for any group of human beings to lose their minds and act with insanity, the Japanese army did their best to imitate that. People who completely went off the rails and just forgot that they had any kind of resemblance or connection to humanity. I normally have my students read this book, and they'll tell me afterward when we're talking about it in discussion that it was very, very, very challenging for them to get through. They said some of them say it's very violent. I say, yes, it's World War II. But in those 6 weeks, in December through January 1938, just 6 weeks. I need to emphasize that again, 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The Japanese army, which had already been in China for about 6 years at this point, they arrived in China in 1931, or if you want to be specific, Manchuria. And by the time you get to 1937, they're already on the move, not just eking or kind of migrating or creeping along. They're in full-scale invasion mode. And as Iris Chang says early in her book, this generation of Japanese soldiers had been raised according to something called the Code of the Bushido, which I guess is translated as the way of the warrior. They were taught to be aggressive from a very young age. I'm talking about from toddler age to adulthood. And they had their own nationalists. Just if Nazism in Germany is nationalism gone run amok, and fascism in Italy is nationalism run amok. Militarism in Japan was fascism or was nationalism run amok. So they had nationalists there, and the nationalists generally, they found their greatest home among them in the army. Now, I need to mention that because the army, toward the end of World War II, toward the beginning of World War II, they're the ones calling the shots. General Tojo is the one who's directing things to happen, and people place a lot of emphasis on Admiral Yamamoto, of course, because he was the mastermind at Pearl Harbor, but Yamamoto was basically following orders. He had been very, very reluctant to attack America. But let me not get ahead of the story. You know, there are so many pictures In fact, it was very difficult to find pictures that wouldn't completely gross you out. I mean, we're not getting here. We're not. This is not about violence porn, but just to drop anchor and establish a very, very firm foothold to show what the Japanese army was doing. So they did stuff that is not even, I won't bother describing it because it is just like I said, over the top in that kind of way. But among other things from the legacy of the Japanese army, this one is probably has one of the, it's all egregious, it's all painful, it's all insulting, it's all in the category, deep in the category of should never have happened. But this one right here, maybe it's because I come from a family where I was just the only boy. But the Japanese army had a component or a policy of enslaving women for the sexual gratification of their soldiers. They were called comfort women. And they did this to women in China, Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, anywhere the Japanese army went, they did this to just about all the civilian female population that they could get their hands on who were not Japanese. And there are women who are in their 80s or 90s now who are still looking for some type of restitution, some type of acknowledgement. Because at this point, there's no amount of money. In fact, there's no amount of money that could have compensated this when they were younger. But they want someone to acknowledge what they went through, because something like this on a colossal scale, while we still hunt the people from the Holocaust, because their crimes against humanity were so egregious, they were so heinous that humanity cries out and says, we can't let this go. So these women don't want time and eternity to catch up with them and forget them. They want someone to remember what happened to them, and for the Japanese government to own up to its responsibility. And that's what Iris Chang talks about in her book, among other things. But she also challenges the reader because there are people inside of China in 1937. There are Nazis in China in 1937, because by 1937, the Nazis and the fascists and the militarists in Japan had signed an agreement that turned them into something called the Axis powers. So Tokyo, Berlin, and Rome were all in bed together. But what happens is that the Japanese army was so cruel that there are members of the Nazi party who stepped in to protect Chinese civilians. Now, we're not used to hearing about the Nazis performing humanitarian services, but such was the context of things in China in 1937, in that 6 weeks, to where even for Nazis, what the Japanese army did was just too much. And we need to remember too, that there were Nazis and then there were Nazis. And the Nazis that I'm talking about, all reprehensible, of course, but people who are just of the variety of people who went along to get along. They joined the party because to not join the party was to be unemployed, not feed your family. People had their reasons. The report put it like this: the massacre was one of the last century's greatest crimes, but few in the West remember it as such because it happened during a conflict that also included one of humanity's greatest crimes. China's reluctance to grapple with it tells us a lot about the risk and rewards of revisiting massacres, lessons that resonate from Armenia to Rwanda, Poland, and Myanmar. When they mention Myanmar, they're talking about the Rohingyas right now, the Rohingya Muslims who are engaged or experiencing a genocide, people have said. And you'll notice that they also lump this with Armenia from 1915 and Rwanda from 1994. So some of the 20th centuries, well, they're all pretty infamous, aren't they? Now, the reason why many people in the West, as Iris Chang points out in her book, don't know about this, particularly in the United States, is because from 1945 until 1990, it was very, very useful for American foreign policy to not bring up what Japan did during World War II, at least this particular incident, because the Cold War dictated reality. And the reality was that we have bases and troops and airplanes and so on stationed in Japan and Okinawa. And we need Japan right there, first off, to offset Korea and also to keep an eye on Russia. And during the Cold War, Japan was a forward staging area, among other things. So it served the purposes of the Cold War to not bring it up too often. Every now and then, these Korean survivors, these Korean women survivors, they simply wouldn't be quiet enough to let people forget about it. And then you had to deal with it. But for the most part, the Japanese government was not all that enthusiastic and still not all that enthusiastic about addressing this. Delving into the dark moments of the past can be empowering, but the politics of the present often reframe and sometimes distort the past. Comparisons between the Holocaust and the Nanjing, which is sometimes called massacre, have been increasingly common in the years since American journalist Iris Chang titled her best-selling book, The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II. Whether or not the historical comparisons are appropriate, the description is part of China's attempt to join in the global rise of victimization narratives. When I have students in my classes, telling me that they're just taking history to check a box so they can move on to the really interesting stuff, I'll tell them, yeah, you need to rethink your priorities, because if you're representing your company in China one day, about to close that big $1 million contract, you start talking about how wonderful you love Japan and Tokyo, you may be talking to the wrong person. There goes your contract and your job, by the way. Connecting Nanjing to other atrocities allows the Chinese to make public this shameful chapter from the past. And scholars have asked, look, the thing that we have to remember also is that for the Chinese, this is not, rooted 70 years ago. For them, this is still recent history. Their foreign policy, their domestic policy, this is being driven, this is part of what drives them right now. Whatever lens they're looking at through the world, this is one of those prisms that they see it through. Because for a long, long time, China was a nation that was conquered, exploited, it was colonized, and China, that's the world power today, its leadership has made up its mind. That's not going to happen again. From now on, they'll be doing the conquering. They'll be the ones throwing their weight around on the international playground. And this right here, this memory is what happens when you allow yourself to get conquered. Maybe it wasn't allow yourself to get conquered, but this is what happens when you get conquered. It also gives legitimacy to their historical claims. If it's not acceptable to deny the Holocaust, it also cannot be acceptable to deny the massacre or other Japanese barbarities, such as medical experiments on live victims in Unit 731 in Harbin. I've heard of Mengele and what he did with twins and altitude experiments and freezing experiments, but honestly, until I read Iris Chang's book, I hadn't heard about Unit 731. They were horrible. Before World War II, we got to establish context. Before World War II, you'll notice the proximity of the Japanese Empire to the Korean Empire. Can you believe it? Once upon a time, the Koreans had an empire. This is what they called it. It's not going to last too long. The colonial powers of the 19th century, from 1850 to 1910, over a 60-year period, carved up China. If you care about proximity or parallelisms in continents, it's in that same period from 1885 to 1900 that Africa is going to be colonized as well in a 15-year period. Now, the situation behind Africa is that Africa, up until 1850, has spent from 1500 to 1850, about 3.5 centuries, basically depopulating itself of its youngest, strongest, best, and brightest through something called the transatlantic slave system. You can't send people like that away from your continent, sell them off for 3.5 centuries, and then not expect somehow some type of consequence. So Africa ends up in a situation where the only two countries that do not get colonized in Africa are Liberia, because out of some weird deference to the United States, and Ethiopia, because, well, they just fight too well. Now, they will get conquered in 1935 when the Italians come back to make them pay for humiliating them, because to not be conquered by a European power in the 19th century is to be the laughing stock of the continent. And the Italians don't take that lying down. When they come back in the 1930s, they make the Ethiopians pay a terrible price for that, because after all, they're being led by Mussolini. But if you take that example and apply that, then overlay that onto China, China has in it Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, and yes, even the United States. This picture right here, as they say, speaks 1,000 words, doesn't it? Everyone's fighting over China, who's either too weak or already dead. But as you can see, the picture communicates something very, very effectively, at least as I interpret it. No one's worried about China. No one's trying to revive China. No one's certainly trying to protect China. They're all there for some reason, their own self-interest. And in this one, you see that sign on the left on his right shoulder, this iron yoke from Japan. And then France's gift, in token of Russia's regard, kind regards of England. All the major powers, all the major industrial powers, and industrializing, meaning Russia, powers are in China to get something. What about the United States? It turns out that when it comes to the United States, that there was a Secretary of State named John Milton Hay. For those of you who are interested in such things, John Hay was also one of the two secretaries of President Abraham Lincoln. So he had a very storied career. After Lincoln's assassination, he goes on to be obviously Secretary of State. And John Hay wanted to make sure that the United States did not lose out in the relationship that was being established, such as you can call it a relationship in China. He established something or advocated something called an open door policy. Basically, listen, Russia, Japan, England, France, Germany, I don't really care about what you guys do in China. With the relationship the United States wanted to have with China was the same one that it had with Africa. Don't want to have a physical presence on the continent, but they do want access to the resources of the continent. So let's agree that there'll be an open door to China. Everybody can go through the open door. We'll all defend it equally so we all can go through. No one can stay out. No person can keep somebody else in or out. It'll be an open door policy. And that way, no one power can take advantage of another or get the upper hand on another power. Now, there was a diplomat who was also sent to the Berlin Conference of 1884 to guarantee that America would have access to African minerals and resources, especially from the area in Central Africa called the Congo, which is still one of the most mineral resource areas on earth. They want to have a physical presence there, just wanted to make sure we could get there and get our stuff and get out. They agreed to it. But as you can imagine, not all the Chinese were going along with this. In 1900, there were a group of people, Chinese nationalists, to make it simple, who staged a rebellion to get the foreigners out. And their first target were Christian missionaries from the West. It was called the Boxer Rebellion. And it was a pretty bloody affair. These guys weren't playing. And the colonizing powers, the imperial powers of Europe and the United States, they got together and put it down pretty brutally. This pretty much ended what was called the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty in China before it became a republic, being led eventually by Chiang Kai-Shek. But what it also did was it took an already weak and divided China and made it even weaker. I remember growing up when the kung fu movies were really popular in the late 70s and 80s, and Bruce Lee was at the height of his stardom. I remember going to see one movie where, and I didn't understand it. You had to actually be from China to understand this phrase, what it meant. But there was, in one movie, they called China the sick man of Asia. I remember thinking to myself, what is a sick man of Asia? Certainly didn't sound positive. But for people from that part of the world, it meant something really, really negative. And when you see this, when you hear about the history of China and how it just keeps on getting perpetually beat up and exploited and taken advantage of, yeah, they called it the sick man of Asia. So yeah, art imitating life again. By August 1900, after nearly 2 months of siege, thousands of American, British, Russian, Japanese, Italian, French, and Austro-Hungarian. Now look, you know you have to be weak if the Austro-Hungarians are beating you up. I mean, those guys didn't even last after the start of World War I. They pretty much collapsed on their own. So all these different nations and empires are there. They successfully put down the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion ends the peace treaty. The final resolution is because of something called the Boxer Protocol, which mandates the punishment of all those involved, to include beheadings in the rebellion, and required China to pay reparations of $330 million to the countries affected. I'm gonna just let that sit for a minute. You have colonizing powers who nationalists in their country saying, we need you to get out. They go, no. They put it down by force. And they go like, and you're gonna pay us for being mad about being colonized. That's called victor's justice. Well, the problems with Japan start not too long afterward. Listen, we need to look and see, if you look at map, that panel on the right, you'll notice that it's not just Manchuria and parts of China that are conquered in red, but also the Korean Peninsula, when Korea is still a unified country, or a unified country dominated by Japan. Japan, early in the 20th century, is making its intentions very well known. And people in the United States are not completely oblivious to this. We're not always behind the 8 ball. There are those who were looking at this, particularly in the early 20th century. There was an individual, a naval theorist named Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote a book, a very famous book at the time, on sea power, which he advocated. He said, look, if America is serious about competing internationally, then what America must do is build a battleship navy, and not just any old kind of battleship navy. I'm talking about a deep ocean, long distance, naval force projecting battleship navy, a mega big battleship navy, biggest ships of the line possible for that day and time, state of the art. You can see Japanese expansion from the legend on this map. Japanese expansion starts in 1870. Acquisitions go on into the 1930s. And then the additional occupation by 1937, additional occupation by 1938, additional occupation by 1939, and so on it went. I guess the point that I'm making is that long before December 7th, 1941, Japan was already at war with a significant part of Asia. And we weren't involved, understandably, because there was a thing called the Depression that had Americans' attention. But there was a time when hell was going to break loose on the world stage. It was already happening in Asia and doing its best to break out in Europe. When the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931, they did it through something called the Mukden Incident, basically where the Japanese army blew up a train and then blamed it on the Chinese, saying that they had acted aggressively. It was a Japanese train, or a train with Japanese soldiers on it. And they used that as a pretext to invade Manchuria and set up a puppet state, and they renamed it Manchukuo. It sounds very similar to the start of World War II, where Nazis crossed the border on the Polish frontier, caused some damage, and say that the Poles did that. And it fits, and it just so happens that that particular type of incident fits right within the narrative of victimization that Adolf Hitler had been peddling for a few years anyway, during the period of the bloodless victories, starting with the expansions in 1935, when he reassumed power of the Rhineland, the Sudetenland, and Auschwitz in 1938, marching into countries without firing a shot, which is why they called them the bloodless victories. Each one of those expansions of territory by the Third Reich was predicated upon some notion, some story that German-speaking civilians or ethnic Germans were being harassed by the dominant population, especially in the Sudetenland. It was a pretext for marching into Czechoslovakia. And it became the pretext for marching into Poland. So it's a page out of the tyrant's playbook. So if you're looking at Japanese expansion before Pearl Harbor, it's pretty extensive. They've got Korea. They're in Korea. Of course, Sakhalin Island, Manchuria. But then something happens in 1904 and 1905, which captured the world's attention again and got the United States to really start making plans for the possibility. No one really thought it was going to happen, because Japan was our ally. At least we didn't really think that they were too much of a threat. But in 1904 and 1905, during the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians are a Pacific power just like we are. The Russians, I remember my political science professor in undergrad saying that during the days of the Soviet Union, to cross the Soviet Union from one end to the other, the Soviet Union spanned 10 time zones. Now we've got Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. It takes about what, 6-7 hours to fly from New York to California? That's just with 4 time zones. Add 6 more to that. That's a big country. That's a really big country. So 10 time zones, which means it's a Pacific power, and the Japanese were already expanding. And as Admiral Mahan said, if you're going to be a big deal in the early 20th century, if people are going to take you seriously as a political, military, international power, you got to have a big navy. Just like now, the reason why Iran wants to get a nuclear weapon is because they know that once they get a nuclear weapon, they'll have joined the club, whatever that club is, but they tell themselves that no one will be able to push them around. Their victim's narrative will have some legitimacy to that, allowing them to use it. The same reason why Kim Jong-un in North Korea, the reason why they want a nuclear weapon, so they can't be bossed around, so they tell themselves. The Russians have a big fleet, the Japanese have a big fleet. Understandably, they're an island nation. They're not going to walk anywhere and do conquest. But in 1904 and 1905, the Japanese Navy, that battle squadron commanded by a man named Admiral Togo, does a classic naval maneuver called the crossing of the T, where basically Japanese ships crossing of the T, the Russian fleet is here, Japanese ships are here. They turn all their guns forward and aft batteries broadside, and they let the Russians have it. They blow them out of the water. It catches the world's attention for several reasons. First off, it's a pretty big victory. It's a masterful stroke. Admiral Togo goes down in naval history for doing this. I mean, just as a matter of command and maneuver and skill and martial capability, Admiral Togo, you check that box all day long. Plus, I mean, just to be blunt about it, in the mindset and culture of the early 20th century, for an Asian nation to beat a European nation is pretty startling. The same way people were surprised when the Ethiopians beat the Italians, that wasn't supposed to happen. Something's going on. In other words, nature must be at odds with itself. The Japanese are saying like, no, we just won. Now, this catches the attention of another upstart nation, which had gone out on some colony grabbing a few years earlier in 1898. During the Spanish-American War, we got Guam, the Philippines, Cuba. The United States notices this because the United States also is a Pacific nation. And its theorist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, has been saying, you need the big Navy, America. America used that big Navy to help it win in the Spanish-American War. So with the Russian fleet sitting at the bottom of the ocean, Theodore Roosevelt mediates the peace between the Russians and the Japanese. And when you're an up-and-coming power and you're chosen to mediate a peace between a long-standing empire like the Russians, I mean, this is the Russia of the Tsars, Ivan the Terrible, Alexander II, who abolished serfdom in 1861. You know, you have that's the Romanov dynasty, which is in charge of this whole country. So Russia's got a big landmass, they have a big army. They are, as my political science professor would say, they're a toothless bulldog. They look mean, but they have no go in them. And the Japanese, who are clearly on the move, on the go, they're doing things. They're aggressive and they're showing that they will fight. So when you're called as an up and coming nation yourself to mediate that peace, it's a feather in your cap as well. In the meantime, there are other things happening in the world. As we advance deeper into the 20th century, on January 3rd, 1925, this guy, Benito Mussolini, actually comes to power in Italy. Now, he had marched on Rome in 1922, but several sources I was checking saying that he actually consolidates power, or this is the date that's identified where he actually is seen as being in charge of the Italian state. Then in 1931, as I mentioned to you all, in 1931, the Japanese in China, they staged that thing called the Mukden Incident. Bear with me as I read. The Kwantung Army had initially wanted to turn Manchuria into a Japanese colony as part of the Japanese Empire. In the end, Japan formed Manchuria into an independent puppet state. Why have a colony that will be corrupt and may or may not do what you say? You can just turn it into a client state and rule it directly. In effect, Manchukuo did become part of the Japanese Empire. As for Puyi, who was the local ruler in Manchuria, he was done, did what he was told. And then in 1933, 2 years later, this guy comes to power in January 1933. Now, the thing that I always make sure I tell my students is that a lot of them think that Hitler somehow overthrew the government. No, he did not. He was actually sworn into office by President Paul von Hindenburg and took the oath of office. So ironically enough, he came to power through a peaceful transfer of power. In March 1938, though, the Reichstag burned. The Reichstag, think of the American Congress, not burning it, but it's the equivalent to the Reichstag. When it burned, it created a crisis in many people's minds. This is how, if you haven't read Timothy Peterson's book on tyranny, How Tyrants Come to Power, It's only about that thick. It's not that big. It's a very fast read, but he gives like 10, 15 things that tyrants do when they're coming to power. He wrote this in 2016, 2017, 2018. But one of the things that Hitler and the Nazis have been doing ever since 1923, when he tried to overthrow the government of Bavaria, was they had been trying to undermine and therefore overthrow the weak Weimar government. The Weimar government, imposed as a result of the Versailles Treaty of 1919, already was weak. More than that, it was never seen as legitimate by most Germans because it was imposed from the outside, especially by the French. French-German animosities had gone back to 1870-71 with the cessation of the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, when the French lost Alsace-Lorraine, and they vowed to get revenge on that, and they did in World War I by seizing German territory. And likewise, the Germans after World War I vowed to get revenge on them, and they did it during World War II. The Reichstag, in the midst of a weak government that could not provide services, meaning water, fire, education, pay, control the economy. If people can't do that, people understandably start looking for an alternative. And here you have this guy Hitler talking about, I can do it, trust me. And when the Reichstag burned, he conveniently burned it on a young Jewish lad who had some mental problems. He couldn't defend himself. And the crisis was another attack from the outside. See what they're trying to do to us? And so then they passed something, the Reichstag passed something called the Enabling Act, which gave him all power in Germany. Now follow this. He's sworn into office legally by German law by the German president, Paul von Hindenburg. This creates fear and uncertainty. And it's 1933, which means that it's 1933 in the midst of, at a time when there's a global economic catastrophe called the Great Depression, which is shadowing people. No, it's not doing more than, it's not shadowing people, it's riding people's backs. It caused catastrophe. It made people afraid. We need to remember that in 1933, America had a population of less than 150 million people. 25% of that population was unemployed. And since most jobs that could take care of a family were held by men, that means that it's a devastating crisis because women, even when they did start working, couldn't find the kind of jobs in which they were available to take care of their families. So this thing was compounding and compounding, compounding, and the economic crisis in Germany had been serious long before the stock market crashed in 1929. This is just like, what do they call it? The perfect storm, the worst of all possible combination of occasions. And now this. And he said, give me power, I can protect you. They gave him power, and he got business. He got busy protecting the people. The first thing he did a few weeks later was opened up a place called Dachau, the first concentration camp. It was the one upon which all other concentration camps and even the death camps were modeled. I visited there twice when I was working with a group of people on a government contract. The first time, some of the guys and I went, and it was okay. It was daunting. It was hard to digest. But I went back by myself on another day because I didn't want to be disturbed having any kind of side conversations. I needed to take in the moment so I could understand what was happening. You can still smell the Zyklon B in the walls. It's a sickly sweet smell, but there's an odor in there that is not natural. It is not natural. And death hovers over that place in a way that will make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. I almost said on your head, but democracy died. Democracy died in Europe or in Germany. If you look at this map, again, what this map is telling us a story. For the moment, the story this map is telling is that Germany, for the moment in 1933, after Hitler's ascension to power, is contained. That containment is a very narrow, momentary thing. This map of territorial changes by Germany, look at the story this map is telling, just following the color code. They incorporate the Saarland in 1935. They remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. 1938, Anschluss. 1938 is also the year, November 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when Jewish synagogues, shops, homes are burned, bombed, and looted. And German citizens stand around, either participate or stand by and watch. Even German policemen stand by and watch. The Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, March 1939, the dismemberment, that's an accurate description, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, the Munich Conference, where Neville Chamberlain flies back to Britain and starts waving around a piece of paper talking about, I've achieved peace in our time. I didn't understand how bad World War I was until I began to look at what people were willing to do to prevent World War II. Because they remembered what World War I had done to them. And they were practically willing to give Hitler anything he wanted so they wouldn't have to do that again. As it turned out, they did it again anyway, didn't they? Well, by 1938, you see here another map. This is from the Holocaust file. Germany's expanding. As I mentioned, Kristallnacht, the nationwide pogrom, November 9th and 10th, 1938. I think I mentioned to you all before in another presentation, it continues to fascinate me. While I was in Germany and before I went to visit Dachau, I was reading the books about Hermann Wouk, The Winds of War and War and Remembrance. And there is a part in the book, I cannot find the edition that I had, but in the forward, I think of the second edition, Hermann Wouk has this discussion with himself where he's asking, he wanted to know why wasn't it that, especially after Kristallnacht, why didn't more Jews leave Germany? Well, it was clearly apparent that things were not getting better. They were only going to get progressively worse. If you looked at the rhetoric coming from Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, all of his officials, Julius Streicher, what they call the Jew baiter, the one who ran that disgusting, bigoted newspaper called Die Stürmer, why didn't they just take that as a sign and leave like Albert Einstein and others did? It's because throughout European history and German history in particular, these kind of things had happened. And leaders came, they did stuff to get in power, and then they got what they wanted, then they backed off and life went back to normal. They thought this would be another one of those times. This wasn't one of those normal kind of leaders. It was always horrible, but they miscalculated. And by the time it got so bad, then they couldn't get out. So they miscalculated. And by 1939, Germany's on the move for sure. But there were difficulties between Japan and the United States. Now listen, it didn't help at all that in the United States, Japanese immigrants were being harassed, something awful, in California. Many historians have said that it was Japanese immigrants who basically invented the agricultural boom that we call the agricultural might of California. They did that. And they were being harassed, as has happened with every new wave of immigrants coming into the United States. The Irish Catholics in the 1840s, the Italians in the early 20th century, people from Mediterranean Europe, but Japanese immigrants were writing back home to Japan to their relatives, talking about what was happening to them in the US. And believe me, people back in Japan were not happy about this. Now, it wasn't the cause of World War II, but can we just agree that it didn't help anything as far as Japanese-American relations? On December 11th, 1937, there was an incident that, just in case anybody had any doubts that the situation between Japan and America was deteriorating, December 11th, 1937, it involved this ship right here called the USS Panay, the Panay Incident. This was one of several gunboats that were very lightly armed. They looked like just pleasure craft, but they were part of the US Navy. They're part of what they call the Yangtze River Patrol. December 11, 1937, the Panay was operating in Nanking. It was clearly identified by its markings and flags as an American ship. And the Japanese, at that same moment, in December 1937, while this boat is on patrol in the Yangtze River, the Japanese are doing what they're doing in Nanking. They're raping Nanking in that same period. The Panay took on board 4 Americans who were skedaddling out of China. They got away from the embassy and some other foreign nationals. Not unsurprisingly, predictably, the Japanese army is losing its mind. People want to get out. They moved upriver. And then the Japanese attacked this ship with aircraft, with bombers, and then straight with fighter planes, the Zeros. The crew fought back, but the Panay was so heavily damaged, eventually the order was given to abandon ship. This made national headlines. And the question was, well, what is America going to do about this? Franklin Delano Roosevelt can't do anything because it turns out that he's the leader of a democratic country that's a constitutional republic. You actually have to ask people as the representatives of people to send their children to war. and people in America were not ready to go to war over this. Not yet. There's a picture of the Panay as it sunk, after it sunk. And a crew member, I guess he's just kind of resigned himself to his fate. World War II in the Pacific was underway. Japanese advances in 1938, 1939 carried on. And this is, again, the war in Europe has not started yet. The war in the Pacific, at least with America, has not started yet. I have this up here so you can see where the Yangtze River is, that blue line right here, the River Patrol. Look at the legend on the map that shows Japanese expansion, 1931, 1938, 1942. For an island nation, this is pretty startling. It's pretty amazing. Whatever the Japanese were trying to do, here's how they put it. The Japanese wanted to establish something called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. That's what they called it. A euphemistic free trade zone. And they also said this: Asia should be for the Asians. What they meant was Asia should be for these Asians, the Japanese. They didn't have any room for an Asia that involved Filipinos, Chinese, Koreans, Malaysians, Vietnamese, anybody else. They intended to dominate like everybody else, like anybody else would. I tell my students all the time, no group of people on earth has cornered the market on being narrow-minded, bigoted, and hateful. And one of the stories that stands out in my mind always about how that proves to be true is when African Americans go back to Africa to establish the nation of Liberia. And when they get there, what do? They do to indigenous Africans the same thing that Europeans did to Native Americans here. So it's the species, right? That's how we're cut. Admiral Yamamoto, during this period, I don't know when he actually got promoted to Marshal Admiral. You think about foreign countries, they're so creative with their ranks. Like Americans just go Admiral. Like, no, we're going to be a Marshal Admiral. Put me in that one. Admiral Yamamoto eventually got the order to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is Yamamoto in 1926, I believe it's 1926, 1927. He spent a year in America as a naval attaché. The guy he's sitting next to is the Secretary of War named Curtis D. Wilbur. Now, what this meant then was that Yamamoto, they don't pick you to be a naval attaché or a representative of a country in another country unless they feel that, first of all, Yamamoto was very intelligent, very handsome guy, already a star rising in the Japanese Navy at this time. He had been to Harvard. He traveled across the country. He liked country music. He liked Americans. He liked American culture. Whereas the Japanese thought that Americans were weak and ephemeral and kind of capricious, Yamamoto knew. And even though it was the Depression, even during the Great Depression, he'd had a chance to look at American industrial capacity before the bottom fell out in the Great Depression. Are you following me? He knew that if this country ever got itself together and had a unified purpose called fighting a common enemy, that enemy was going to have some problems. Americans are divided on any given day, but when you bring them together, if when they come together and you're the one they're focusing on, you have a problem. He understood this. That's what he tried to warn his bosses about in the Japanese army, particularly Hideki Tojo. Now, just to wrap up on the Yangtze River Patrol, they call themselves the Yangpats. The Yangtze Naval Patrol, that force was a naval force with trifling combat power. In other words, very lightly armed, but they carried appreciable heft. In other words, their impact was bigger than their bark or their bite, diplomatically. It was gunboat diplomacy at its finest, and they were generally stationed. They were created in 1919, so therefore, at the end of World War I, their mission was to safeguard American lives and property. They performed with distinction in the 1920s and 30s, and they basically were a very big help to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek, leader of the Nationalist Chinese Party, who was in nominal control of China after the fall of the Qing dynasty. They were based in the Philippines, which I found to be very interesting because I think they said in Cavite, and I know where that is, having grown up in the Philippines. Then comes December 1931. The world is hurtling toward a catastrophe. September 1931, the German army, the Wehrmacht, rolled across the Polish frontier, and somewhat echo of World War I, the British had guaranteed Polish neutrality. The Germans had been sent a message to evacuate Poland. They did not do it. So Neville Chamberlain had to tell the British people that this country, quote, is at war with Germany. I say an echo of World War I because World War I, the British had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. And when Germany invaded Belgium as the fastest route to get into France, because according to a plan called the Schlieffen Plan that had been designed by a guy named Alfred Graf von Schlieffen, if Germany thought it was going to go to war again with France, they wanted to be the first to get there first. And with Russia on their right flank, they figured that the greater, more advanced, capable enemy was the French, and they were right. They said, if we attack over here first and take care of these guys in the West, then we'll have plenty of time to mop up the Russians, who by the time we get there, they'll just be getting themselves, they'll just be waking up and eating their cornflakes. But as it was, they violated Belgian neutrality that brought Britain into the First World War. They violated Polish neutrality that brought the British into the Second World War, and World War II was on. This is not from the Polish invasion. This is from Operation Barbarossa that occurred about 2 years later. But it just shows, I like using this picture because if you look at the determination on that German soldier's face, that guy's about his business, holding a German grenade. And as he often did, Hitler went out to meet the troops and wave at the troops and give a Sieg Heil to the troops. The German advance was amazing. During the interwar years, they had developed a thing called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And more than that, lightning war was of a variety. It wasn't just fast moving. It was a combination of Wehrmacht, a combination of infantry, armor, and air support. In the Marine Corps, they call that combined arms, where you have artillery laying down covering fire for you seconds or just moments before the infantry moves in. The tanks are on the flanks, on the flanks, providing shock forces. And then you have air cover suppressing anybody else that's trying to get at you, taking out bunkers, taking out artillery positions. It is well coordinated. It is like a martial ballet when it's done right. And they were doing this correctly. Well, look, you all saw this coming. On December 7th, 1941, the world had been at war for 2 years in Europe. It had been at war for at least 10 years in Asia. And on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese, having steamed across the Pacific Ocean more than 3,000 miles, they had less than time in late November. They chased a bad weather system because even though things were getting pretty advanced, they still were not as advanced as we are today. And so the best thing they could do was to make sure that they kept beneath a bad weather system, thick clouds. For them, bad weather was a friend, because there were long-range aircraft called PBYs. Their only job was to fly long distances and look for trouble. And they knew that the Japanese were smart enough to know that we might have known they were coming, and we might have been looking for them, because diplomatic relations have been getting more and more acrimonious. So both sides knew something was going to happen. It's just that one side was the only one that knew when it was going to happen. So on the morning of December 7th, these Japanese aircraft, there were six Japanese attack carriers. And they had a variety of aircraft on them: Kate torpedo bombers, Val dive bombers, the A6M0, the best aircraft in the world at that point, unless in the Pacific theater. I mean, the A6M0 could literally, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, it could literally fly rings around the best American aircraft. There's nothing we had that could stand up against it. They spun up the propellers on that morning and took off. They took off to the cries of "Banzai" as each airplane lifted from the deck of the carrier. In World War II, because they don't have nuclear powered carriers, and if you're going to get enough lift under a wing of an aircraft, in addition to the propeller pulling it forward, the captain would tell the captain of the aircraft carrier, turn into the wind. If you're turning into the wind, that causes more wind to flow across the deck. And as you pull yourself into the wind, then you get a lift and then you take off. They took off. They formed up in flight. The guy who was leading the attack, the chief tactical planner, was a guy named Commander Minoru Fuchida. The one who was actually leading the attack was Commander Genda. When they came in sight of Pearl Harbor, they said 3 words: Tora, Tora, Tora. Attack, attack, attack. It was perfect surprise. Perfect surprise. Perfectly executed surprise. This is a 0. More than 2,000 Americans lost their lives that morning. And you got to recognize Yamamoto's brilliance here. Attack the Americans on a Sunday morning, early on a Sunday morning. It's the day they go to church. And it's December. They won't have their minds back until January anyway. It's a holiday, it's Sunday, and it's 7 a.m. They'll never see it coming, and they didn't. In the aftermath, General Walter Short, the Army commander, senior Army commander, was relieved of command. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, the senior naval commander, was relieved of command. Somebody's heads had to roll. So those were the 2. More than 2,000 dead. President Roosevelt went before the Congress the following morning, December 8th, 1941. And I'm sure you all have heard the speech where he said, "This day shall live in infamy." This nation was at peace with Japan. But the part of that speech that I like the most is when he says, there's no blinking at the fact many American lives have been lost and great damage has been done to our people. There's no blinking at the fact. In other words, let me give you the bad news. Similar to what Winston Churchill did. All I can offer you is blood and toil and tears and sweat. Leaders who told you the truth because they had the confidence that, yeah, you're going to be rattled, you're going to be afraid, but I also know you can take it. And more than that, this is what we have to do. This is what we have to do. So once people dusted themselves off and got over the shock, I have not been able to track down as to whether or not this actually happened, but there's a kind of like a story that goes that in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, as Japanese sailors and other people were celebrating, someone asked Admiral Yamamoto, what do you think? What do you think about our big victory? And he said, I'm afraid that all we have done is awaken the sleeping giant. He wasn't wrong. And this newspaper article from the Boston Daily Globe says, Japan strikes all over the Pacific. Take a look at this map. This is astonishing. Now look, the thing to keep in mind about the Pacific Theater is that the Pacific Theater was actually larger than the European theater. Don't let the fact that it's water divert you from the fact that the Japanese are doing all this. If in fact, do think about the water. They're doing all this on top of water, not land. An island nation with a finite number of people. They had before it's all over with, they will be in the Gilbert Islands, and we will have to take all of these. The Solomons, Guadalcanal, August 7, 1942. Guam, the Marianas, where we'll finally start launching those raids against the Japanese home islands. Everything that will be done up until 1943, 1944 is to get within striking distance of what's happening here, what's happening in the European theater are coordinated events. After the Russo-Japanese War, I forgot to mention this to you all. After the Russo-Japanese War, and the Japanese caught the Americans' attention as more than just a passing thought, somebody asked a question at the War Department, what would happen if we ever had to fight these guys one day? The response was, but they're our allies, or they're not a threat. Yeah, but just humor me. What if we had to fight them one day? So they developed a war plan called Plan Orange in the early 20th century. And Plan Orange kind of sat in the file drawer, gathering dust until when? December 8th, 1941. They pulled it out. That was the only thing they had to go from. You'll also be shocked, I suppose, to find out that some of the maps that we had of the Pacific area, we had maps that had not been updated since Captain Cook's voyages of the 1700s. So to say that we were starting from behind the 8 ball is to put it mildly. But this land, this sea area, this area actually is bigger than the European theater. And then you look at China and Manchuria. And this is where the China-Burma-India Theater really takes on some significance. It was already there. It was already important because of what they had been doing in China. But with the Japanese spread that far out, that means that logistically, they can't afford for too much to go wrong. In fact, they can't afford for anything to go wrong. Now, at the start of World War II, when they hit us on December 7, 1941, that's a declaration of war, obviously. 4 days later, I guess because maybe he had nothing else to do, Hitler declared war on America. So now we have both America and the European theater and the Pacific theater war. The decision had been made in the War Department that if in fact we found ourselves at war with both Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, that the priority would be to defeat Nazi Germany first. That answers the question about how come MacArthur never got the resources and manpower that he wanted. The priority was put on Europe first because the Nazis were seen as being the bigger existential threat. And that plan was called Rainbow 5. So you have Plan Orange and Rainbow 5. Rainbow 5 is what became the foundation for planning the D-Day invasion long before D-Day became something that Americans were talking about. But in the meantime, when they're trying to get forces and troops built up in the European theater, that includes flying one plane at a time across the Atlantic, across the Arctic Circle to England to build up a bomber force called the 8th Air Force, one at a time. And this is where women are flying these aircraft across the Arctic Circle as well, and performing flight duty by towing targets so men can shoot at them and whatnot. They're called the Women Air Service Pilots or the WASPs. We had people who are out there in Detroit building B-24s and a whole lot of other things too. As America ramps up, Rainbow 5 goes into operation. And we need time for that force to build up. We need time to gather things, to get things in place, to get staged for a cross-channel invasion, for Operation Torch in 1943, for the Plisti raid in August 1943 to try to take out the Romanian oil fields. All of that emphasizing Europe. And in the meantime, you're fighting the Japanese on a shoestring budget. That's made possible because American and British forces in China, Burma, and India are keeping them tied down. Imagine, look at the map. Imagine if all those Japanese forces somehow were free to go elsewhere and fight in the Pacific. So the value of China, Burma, India, among other things, not the only one, but chief, is that they tied down significant numbers of Japanese forces and aircraft and pilots who would otherwise have been thrown into the fight in other areas of the Pacific, where the Japanese proved themselves to be deadly fighters anyway. Americans had a wake-up call, quite frankly, when it came to fighting the Japanese. You go back and look at some of the cartoons of the Japanese, they show them wearing these big, thick glasses and buck teeth, very racist tropes and whatnot. But on Guadalcanal, believe me, the Marines on Guadalcanal, they would tell you there was nothing funny about the Japanese soldier that they confronted in that island. Nothing at all. They were skilled, they were tough, they were battle hardened, and they had been at it for a decade, and they were ready for us. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, now that we were in the war, he had a partnership with this guy, Chiang Kai-Shek. Chiang Kai-Shek was the one who basically rose to power after the Qing dynasty fell. He was the leader of a group of people called the Kuomintang, or the nationalist Chinese. The Kuomintang were the group of people who were kicked off of mainland China in 1944. They ended up on what was called then Formosa. Today we call it Taiwan. Ever heard of it? Okay. Chiang Kai-Shek had a problem, a complicating problem, in that he had been at war with this guy to his left, Mao Zedong. A civil war had been going on in China for years. And of course, Mao and his followers became very famous for something called the Long March, where they marched thousands of miles, fighting the Japanese army and fighting against the Kuomintang. These guys were battle hardened as well. And it turned out that just like the Americans, the world's largest capitalist power, and the British, the world's largest colonial power, and the Russians, the world's largest communist power, found enough common sense to set their differences aside to focus on a common enemy, the Nazis. These two characters put their differences aside long enough to focus on a common enemy called the Japanese. Now, when World War II is over, they'll go back to beating each other up. But for the moment, they got to get rid of the Japanese, and the Americans are that helped them. As I mentioned, there were complications because Chiang is a nationalist, Mao is a communist. And there's another thing to know about Chiang Kai-Shek. He may have been the boss, but the person in charge was his wife. Madam Chiang was said to be the brains of the operation. She was no joke. This map right here gives us, I've been waiting to get to this. This map gives you an idea of the area, the scale to be covered by the China-Burma-India Theater. This was the if you worked or fought in the CBI, this was the arm patch that you got in the military. This says that you were in China, Burma, India. Somehow those three symbols, definitely the one on the left, China, Burma, and India, this meant you were in that theater, CBI. The China-Burma-India Theater took a backseat to Europe and the Pacific in terms of manpower, resources, and press coverage, but it's stories of daring pilots who flew the hump of the mighty Himalayas, freewheeling guerrilla fighters known as Merrill's Marauders, dedicated nurses fending off amorous advances, and crafty intelligence agents cutting deals with natives in 3 diverse countries who were as colorful as those from the more heavily documented areas of World War II. The hump, as they call it, were the Himalaya Mountains. The US Army Air Force and the British Royal Air Force flew transport planes across these mountains on a regular basis. If you know anything about the Berlin Airlift, the reason why these forces were able to keep Japanese forces pinned down, the reason why ground forces could do that was because they were supplied by air, one plane at a time, flying over the hump of the world, the Himalaya Mountains. Not glamorous. These flights were long, they were boring, they were dangerous. They weren't flown with the fastest aircraft, but they were necessary. They had airplanes like this one, the C-46 Commando. Or this one, there's another Commando. This one, famous aircraft, the Douglas C-47 Skytrain. These things are still flying. Most of you all probably know I am an airplane nerd. I saw a C-47 parked in a cornfield in Ohio one time going to visit my sons, and I said, I wonder how much that thing costs. But the C-47 was used on D-Day for paratroops. It's been used for firefighting. It's been used for all kinds of things. It's one of those aircraft. It's like the 707. The C-130 Hercules. It's just a multi-purpose aircraft that's been used for everything. The Hercules has been used for as a gunship, transport, firefighting, human relief, everything. So these aircraft and the pilots who flew these missions, they weren't recognized as that descriptor said. But what they did was so essential. But it wasn't the only thing they did. But also, we're going to talk about in future weeks, people like this guy, Claire Chennault. Claire Chennault, who at one time in America, they called him a washed up fighter pilot. His military career was over. They said he was too old, not very well. But he went to China. Chiang Kai-Shek said he needed pilots and an air force because the Chinese didn't have one. The Japanese were beating the tar out of them. Claire Chennault said he knew he still had some gas in the tank. So he went there. He got a bunch of troublemaking US fighter pilots, people that got thrown out of the Army or didn't want to be in the US Army. These guys wanted to fight. So they went to where the fight was. They didn't wait for it to come to them. And they formed something called the AVG, the All Volunteer Group. You probably have heard of them as called the Flying Tigers. And they flew old aircraft, P-40 Warhawks, P-40 Tomahawks, P-40 Kitty Hawks. They could not match the jet. They had shorter range, light armored, not as much gunpowder. But so what they did, they took all the aircraft's weaknesses and devised tactics to turn those weaknesses into a strength. And then started racking up a kill ratio that made the Japanese jaw drop. These are some of the P-40s. You can see how this is not as sleek, doesn't even look as powerful as the Zero. And then we're gonna talk about this guy, General Joseph Stillwell. He's one of the more unsung heroes of World War II. People really need to talk about him a lot more because he's the one who almost single-handedly brought American forces together to have any kind of strategy or tactics against the Japanese in World War II in the China-Burma-India Theater. When you hear about his nickname was Vinegar Joe, and he had that nickname for a reason. This is Stillwell with Madam Chiang. That's the backdrop to the China-Burma-India Theatre. That's how we got involved. That's some of the things that were going on in that area of the world before World War II started. And we're going to delve into the details of what was going on in CBI, why it was important, how it helped to win World War II, just like the European theater did, and the Pacific theater did, and the heroes that came out of that. We're going to look at Merrill's Marauders and those brave pilots who flew the hump. We're also going to take a look at a guy named Father Emil Capon. Father Capon will go on to lasting fame in Korea, but Father Capon will show what kind of man he is in the China-Burma-India Theater. What he does in China-Burma-India is just a foreshadowing of the kind of human being he is, the humanity and the love for humanity that he has, even though he's a military chaplain. But that'll be for next week, okay? Thank you. Questions? Or if they're in the chat, I'll take them.
I don't have anything in the chat yet.
Okay.
I've got a question. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. Hi. Just a comment. The Americans had done some substantial, well, let's call it blockades or embargoes against the Japanese prior to Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
I suppose in response to their other expansionist activities, and I believe that they embargoed oil and steel and rubber and things like that, that I think ultimately, whether it would have happened ultimately or not, drove the Japanese to say, number one, we have to expand to get those raw materials, and number two, we probably have to do something against the United States.
You're absolutely right. In the Japanese view of things, first of all, they were intent on expanding. They were intent on establishing an empire. To do that, you need, if you're Japan and you're an island nation, you need a battle navy that runs on oil, gasoline for your army. If you can't do it at home, Japan is an island nation with few resources. And especially for a modern army that needs rubber, you either got to get it from Liberia. Liberia, the rubber plantations were owned by Firestone in Akron, Ohio. That wasn't going to work. And the Americans, yes, America had been exporting oil and steel to Japan, but because of the atrocities that they were committing in China and other things, and especially after the Panay incident, there was an embargo. The decision was made that they're not going to go to Africa and get it. So they decided they're going to go on a conquest spree and get the rubber from Indonesia and Malaysia and oil from elsewhere. And they figured that the only thing standing in their way, the only major thing standing in their way was the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. So that's part of what drove that decision. You're absolutely right.
I have two observations. One
Yes.
is, I think of the manpower it took for Japan to conquer that huge area.
Yeah.
And then secondly, with regard to Germany and Hitler, how did they have the ability to persuade those populations to get behind what those dictators were doing? And I guess the analogy would be, you have the anti-vaxxers in the United States, and you think, how did
Well, let me address Germany first, because your observation is spot on. The thing to remember about Germany is that the military in Germany had a much more positive image to people than the military has had in the United States. For most of American history, people distrusted the military because inheriting a mindset from the Revolution and the War of 1812, the early republic, the military has always been used by dictators or monarchs to suppress people. So for a long, long time, it was a very, very, not hostile, but not a very friendly relationship between the US military and the civilian population. That doesn't really happen. That doesn't really begin to change until after World War II, when the military is seen as in a more positive light for obvious reasons of the contributions to victory. And rightfully so after Vietnam, and particularly after Gulf War I, when veterans start coming home from Gulf War I, and we realize in hindsight what we did not do for Vietnam veterans coming home. So people have a reckoning. People understand that we need to redeem ourselves. And that's when you start hearing things like, thank you for your service. And so the military the reputation of the military as an all volunteer force. Nobody liked to draft. So we went to an all volunteer force after Vietnam. And the military became the GI Bill, made it an attractive thing to do. It became a thing you go and join to get to be upwardly mobile. That's what my father did. That's what I did to some extent. So the military is a through point to greater opportunities. So that's the first thing. Now in Germany, they didn't have to go through all that. In Germany, after World War I, it was generally believed that the people who signed the peace treaty at Versailles stabbed the German army in the back. You could do nothing worse for a German citizen than to betray the honor of the military. Because the military as a class was seen as very, very, again, cherished, a patriotic good thing to do. They were considered to be a very positive kind of thing. So when you stab an institution like that in the back, then people took that personally. And then too, there was this feeling of betrayal that happened after World War I, not to mention that in a brief exchange of letters between the French foreign minister, Georges Clemenceau, and the German minister at Versailles, the German minister at Versailles came to the conference saying, we thought we were going to be treated with equanimity and with fairness, and that we all have blood on our hands, and that there wouldn't be victor's justice. But what we got in here, you want us to sign this thing called Article 231, which is the war guilt clause, saying that Germany is responsible for starting the war and all the misery of the war and paying reparations too. And he said the German people cannot stand this, cannot digest this. And Clemenceau told the German minister, look, here's the situation. Let me explain this to you, just in case you didn't notice. We won. That's the first thing. We won, you lost. So if we get that clear, you'll understand part two. And because we won, we're telling you, you're going to sign this thing. And if you don't, we had troops that are poised on your border and occupying your territory right now. We will flip the light back on and continue the war if you don't sign this. Can you understand that? They had no choice but to sign it. And within days of signing the peace treaty, there was the rumor of an international plot hatched by Jews and other communists and so forth. And so when Hitler comes along and starts blaming what people already believed, the big lie was already out there. So stabbing the German army in the back and finding someone who's going to sit there and embrace the big lie and spread it to meet people's expectations, that explained, not completely, but a big part of what led the German citizens into doing what they do and following Hitler. Plus, they were economically desperate and were looking for some way of getting out of that problem and getting it from under Versailles. In Japan, Irish Chang leans very heavily on this whole thing called the Code of the Bushido, and children were being taught early on about nationalism and how the foreign invader and looking at China. I mean, they used the idea of colonialism to their advantage, saying that's why they said Asia for the Asians. And it made sense since Asia had been dominated by foreign powers. And so the Japanese said, why should we be let us out happen to us? And we should get involved. It's just like I said, they didn't mention that fine print about the Asians they were interested in were the Japanese, which again does not explain it comprehensively, but it's a big part of what led Japanese citizens, not to mention in Japan as well, the military, the army had so frightened people that to speak against them was to be disappeared or be executed. I mean, somebody as prominent as Isoroku Yamamoto was fearing for his life before the start of World War II because there was an assassination plot rumored to be against him. So he got in step and did what he was told.
Very good. Okay, about 25 years ago, we went with our daughter to Korea, and you mentioned comfort women early in your presentation. And there was a protest outside the Japanese embassy. It had been going on weekly for many, many years. And it was interesting because the Korean soldiers were kind of protecting the embassy. And across the road were mostly older women.
Yeah.
It's kind of just all this heavy military, protecting against some women. Of course, they thought there might be somebody else. Do you know if that's still going on?
I've heard that at the last at least the last 5 years.
Fred, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, John said that a number of years ago, he went to Korea with he and his wife went to Korea with his daughter, and they witnessed a protest against the Japanese embassy. And there were people who were protesting the Japanese embassy, and there were soldiers standing outside the embassy, keeping the embassy personnel and the protesters separate from each other. But he pointed out that across the street, there were older women who I presume may have been relatives of, or maybe had actually been comfort women. And he wants to know, are those kind of protests still going on? And I was going to say that I read about that kind of thing as recently as 3 years ago. So I don't know if anything like that has happened in the last year or two, but as recently as 3 years ago, there were still either comfort women who are really getting on in years now, or their relatives who still want the Japanese government to come and admit what they did and make restitution, or at least acknowledge it at a minimum.
The Japanese said they were volunteers.
Yeah, they've been skirting that around, and the comfort women and their relatives have held the American government accountable for enabling the Japanese to be able to skirt around this and not deal with it. And like I said, it was very, very, very useful during the Cold War when we needed Japan to offset Russian and Chinese power in that part of the world, in East Asia. One more.
I got a little confused about what was the main group or that was in charge of the Japanese spread to the other Asian nations.
The Japanese army, the Japanese government was dominated by the army. Okay, so the Japanese militarists, army and navy, were running the country. They had the Emperor Hirohito was a figurehead. He was God man, etc. But it was the army that was running the government, and the chief general of our army, Hideki Tojo, was the one that was calling the shots. Iris Chang in her book says that Japanese people in the Japanese military have been raised according to something called the Code of the Bushido, which is what the samurai warriors follow. It's called the Way of the Warrior. So while they were not samurai, they may not have been from that class, they were taught to have that mindset. Very aggressive, very honorable, very to see themselves as superior to other people. The comment is the military was an honorary society. Let's put it like this. It was a good thing to be in the military. A good thing to be in the military, good to be in the Navy, better to be in the Army. If you ask me, I would say it's better to be in the Marine Corps. Any other questions?
Nothing else in the chat.
Nothing else in the chat? Okay.
Great.
You guys
Thanks.
look lovely. You always do. I'm so glad to be with you again. See you next week.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.